Go.
Hello, and thanks for taking time to hear the lesson today. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about the last chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. I may come back to this, but you may know by now that there are actually in the Jewish tradition, the Torah includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so this lesson is on that last book, Deuteronomy. And it comes at a time in the life of the people of Israel that is very, very significant. Because Moses, who has been leading them, who there's a long story behind Moses. I guess if you were to talk to most any Jew, you ask, who is the most important person in your faith? They would say Moshe, because that is what the Hebrew name really is, and it means drawn from the water. And you remember that they were captives down in Egypt, and the Pharaoh was trying to kill off all these babies, and Moses' mother wanted to, along with his sister, took Moses, wrapped him up, and put him in a basket and put him in the Nile River. And as God would have it, you remember the daughter of the sister of Moses asked the daughter, when she found the daughter of Pharaoh's daughter found Moses, asked if she could come and help raise him. So he was raised by his own family in the house of Pharaoh, and so he lived there. But then one day he was out and he saw these folks, these Egyptian slave drivers, beat one of the Israelis. He knew he was Israeli, and he ends up killing the man. And he's so afraid to get caught, he takes off. And he's gone for 40 years. And now think about 40. That's going to come up, because like in Jesus, we have that situation of Jesus that when he comes and he starts his ministry, he goes into the desert, for 40 days, and tempted by the devil and overcomes the devil. And in some ways, there is a parallel there between the way that Moses got himself involved back into freeing the people of Israel. To get back to those 5 books in the Hebrew or Jewish tradition, regardless of which strain it is, the Torah is the most important thing. The 5 books that comprises the Torah, and the Jews, what we would call the Bible, is called the Tanakh. And that has the same basic books that we have in what we call our Old Testament, which is, of course, the Hebrew text. And the Tanakh is spelled Tanakh. But many Jews, not all, but many of the more conservative or Orthodox Jews believe that the 5 books were actually written by Moses. Well, that presents a lot of problems when you think about it, but we won't go there right now. But I want to read a little bit of the scripture here from Deuteronomy 34, beginning with verse 1. It says, when Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead, as far as Dan, all of Nephthah, and the plain and the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, and as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. and I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. And that is the story we're going to talk about somewhat today. And that is that Moses, something happened, which we'll talk about shortly, that God chose to not let Moses go into the holy promised land. And so we're dealing here with the death of a great man. And before he dies, God takes him and he says, here is the land promised to Abraham. Now that takes us all the way back, a long way before Moses, of course. And I can't, when you try to think about this, there's a sense in which that text, I guess I better read that text on down. It says that he was buried, Moses died, he was buried in the land of Moab, opposite Bethel, but no one knows his burial place to this day. He was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plain of Moab for 30 days, and then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. And then that's when Joshua is going to take over. But then it goes on, and here's where it's really the most significant verse as far as I'm concerned. It says, never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequal in all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all of his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and for the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all of Israel. What had happened was that the people had been taken out. They had freedom from Egypt's slavery, and so we found ourselves reading here about the fact that they're in a place where there is no water, there is nothing for them to drink at all, and so they raise up against Moses and his brother Aaron, who was always right with him. But their whole goal was to free them from the land of slavery in Egypt. But what they found out is a case of a lot of things that happens to us. We get free sometimes from some things, and we're not quite as free as we think, because they were territorially, they were out of Egypt and they were free. But in their heart, they still were not free. They were begging him, take us back to Egypt. At least we had something to eat there. We had something to drink. That's the whole point of the story. And so I never can think of freedom without thinking of my late father-in-law. He was born and raised in the hills of Arkansas, and he had very little formal education, but he's probably one of the wisest men that I've ever known, and certainly one of the most loving men that I've ever known. But he had all these hillbilly adages, I'd call them, you know. But he had one that I wish I'd written down. I bet I could have written down 15 or 20 over the years that just sort of pop out of him. I remember one time, back when I was younger, I always had an old car. It wasn't worth much, and I was always having to work on it. And he helped me oftentimes. And I remember us working on this old car one day, and we'd been working on it all day and trying to get this thing fixed, and both of us would grease it all over us. We went to this auto parts place to get a part for that car. And we walked in, and, he has no hatred toward anybody. I never heard him say a bad word toward anybody. So the guy who was the clerk behind the counter, though, treated him, because he was the one that was asking for the part, treated him as if he were a dummy. That's the way I would put it. He didn't give him any respect at all. He just saw him as an old man who was dirty and a lot of grease. So he got the part, and we were walking out of the store, across the parking lot, and my father-in-law, Pap, I called him, he said to me, "That guy is about as free as a hog on ice." Now, I like to fell over because that's just one of those things that he would throw out. The reality is hogs can't walk on ice, and so they're not free at all. And so that was the way in which he was expressing his feelings about the way he had been treated. And I laughed about that for a long time, and I can't think of it now without thinking of it then. Well, the Israelites were like that. They were out of Egypt, but they weren't free. They hadn't gotten the slave out of them. You know, in our country, we have a history of slavery. And there's a lot of people that still haven't gotten, I'm talking about good, quote, good Christian people that haven't gotten the slave mentality out of their heart. And it grieves me, I think it grieves God that we have continued to have that kind of hatred. You think a minute for all of the faithfulness that was demonstrated in the life of Moses. That when God says, "Go and hit that rock with a shaft that you got in your hand, and water will come out for the people." So what Moses did was that he went and hit it, but basically he said, "You people are making me and Aaron bring out water." That's why God chose God's punishment for Moses. Believe this now. This is, you didn't trust me to show my holiness. This is in Numbers 20. Before the eyes of the Israelites. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly, this group of people, into the land that I have given them. And God stayed with it. Moses didn't like it at all. In fact, there are 3 or 4 times in the scripture you can find where he complains about the fact he's not going to get to go to the promised land. Well, when you think about it, I've always thought, that, gosh, that's a terrible penalty for what little thing he did to me. But after all Moses had done, he had done what God asked him to do, but he had that one trip up. Now that may not seem fair to you as it does to me, but I remember one time I was teaching this particular scripture. Maybe I was preaching it, I don't know. But I said, that it looks to me like God's better answer would be just to send him off for a good course in anger management. And that might help Moses more than keeping him out of the promised land. But half a dozen times Moses does complain about it. And God says, "No, you can see the land, but you can't put one foot in it." Now, what kind of God would do that? Well, that's the point. What kind of God would do that? The God who is the maker of heaven and earth and all things visible, and as the Apostles' Creed says, and the maker of all things visible and invisible. I've come to understand this a little better by listening and studying some of the Jewish commentaries. Because the Jews have a different understanding of why Moses got punished the way he did. And the first answer they give is that in his anger, Moses desecrated God's holy name. In other words, he violated the commandment of you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. The text says Jehovah will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. That's in Exodus 27. If you know anything at all about Jewish practices in general, and not all Jews, of course, are alike. In fact, debating issues is part of their faith. And it's too bad that in our faith, that sometimes we have a trouble debating, we get to arguing. And that's one of the big differences, I think sometimes between the way we deal with conflict. Are we go and build another Baptist church somewhere else? But the one thing that the Jews do not do is they do not use the Lord's name in vain. That they won't even say the Lord's name in vain. For example, I want to show you, and I hope you can see this, but this is, I have written here the Hebrew name for God. That when Moses asked him, what's your name? Well, this is what he gave him. Well, the only problem is that that's unpronounceable. Now, some people think that, first of all, there are no vowels in Hebrew. No vowels. They have, when I was in seminary and took Hebrew, they have these little markings that tell you whether that's an A or an E or something. And after a while, you sort of got to know which one is which. But the Hebrew text in itself, if you go to a Jewish synagogue, it's going to be there won't be any vowels in it because the language doesn't have any vowels. And then by the 3rd century, the consonants were considered so sacred that you couldn't pronounce even the consonants. The HWH is in Hebrew is to be. And God says, use that when God said, I am who I am. And the Jewish scholars today usually write, when they're writing their books or articles, they always put a dash in the place of an O between G and D. If they're a Jew and they're writing, that's the way you're going to see it. And that's what you should understand that to be. But what happened was that this word Adonai means Lord. It was used to talk about the kings of the day. And Christian scholars came along and took the vowels of Adonai and inserted them into the JHWH and made Jehovah. See what they did? And so we now, when you hear the word Jehovah, that is not in the Bible. That is a Christian theologians, the Christian, not just one theologian. That is the way that Christian, if they're going to use the word Jehovah, very seldom do they do, because that's not really I'd call it a legal academic name. Although we got a religious group called Jehovah Witnesses. I've often wondered if they knew how Jehovah came about, but that's the way it is. That's just something I'm throwing in for my benefit, I guess, here. I'm not one who's guiltless of using 4-letter words. I've done that, unfortunately, and still do it according to my wife. But using God's name in vain is just something that just eats me up. I'll be honest with you. I used to play golf with a guy who was a Christian, who was a Church of Christ layperson. One of the finest men I've ever been around in my life. And I mean, he knew the Bible. He was a good partner to play golf with because he never got mad. I always said if I ever got mad on the golf course, that's the last time I'm going, because I'm not a good golfer, never will be. But it's just the thing, just keep hitting that ball till you get it in the hole. That's what I think one of the golfers' father told him when he was a kid. We were playing golf one day, though, and he had his son with him. His son happens to be deaf and mute, and he has some other neurological issues. But he brings Rodney along just so that Rodney has an opportunity to get out and do things. And so this guy joins us. He comes driving up after we're up there on the tee box getting ready to tee off on the first hole, and he wants to join us. Well, as a rule, I go up to a golf course tomorrow, and I walk up to a group of, say, 3. The chances are very great that they're going to let me play with them, in spite of how bad I play. That's just good etiquette in golf, isn't it? Well, this fella, we went ahead and hit the ball. In fact, one of us had already hit. So we said, you go ahead and hit. And the guy gets up and he hits, and his ball goes out of bounds, all unfindable. It's gone. And he lets out this long string of profanity using God's name. And I thought to myself, oh man. And I thought, well, I'm gonna say something to him down here at this next because this is the kind of situation you don't get back together till you're on the green, and then you only have a chance to talk when you're on the tee box. And I thought, I'm gonna say something to that man about that. But my friend Gwen beat me to the punch. He walked up to that man and he said, "Sir, the kind of language you're using is offensive to me. And I think it's offensive to God. And I don't want to be mean towards you, but why don't you just go ahead and hit the ball and play by yourself, and we'll follow you, and we won't get in your way." Well, that's a good story and a bad story from my standpoint, because here I am, I'm the preacher, and I'm the one who, here's a layperson who's stepping up and speaking out. And I just thought that was I've never forgotten it. It's just one of those things that it makes you feel good that there's some people out there who they're not professional Christians, and they're able to stand up for God. And I think that says a lot. Well, so that's one of the reasons that the Jews give for the treatment that God gave Moses. The other reason was that most of the people, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and all the other religions believed in many gods. And not only did they believe in many gods, but they believed that these gods could be controlled through various rituals, by doing various things. They were supreme, but not supreme. They could be overcome by human beings. And when Moses shouted angrily, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Moses is heard by the people as if he and Aaron were going to bring water. He and Aaron were going to bring the water out of the rock, rather than acknowledging the Lord as the supreme power that God is. Moses wanted to show his own authority, and he let it get out of hand. Now, most of us have done something like that. if we're honest with ourselves. Sometimes we've said things that we wish we had never said to other people. And sometimes they're the best thing, I think, the most wonderful cleansing of your soul, I believe, is that when you have violated some other person, to be able to be big enough of a Christian and person to go and apologize and say, look, I'm sorry, because we're all human. We tend to be very hard on ourselves, really. I think most of us who are trying to be Baptist, a good Christian and good Baptists, Wilshire Baptists, let me put it that way. I think that most of us, we're doing as hard as we can. We're doing a good job. It's just that God's grace sometimes is hard to accept. We want to earn our salvation. No, that's the story where it's wrong. And when you put Jesus and Moses side by side, here they are, they start their ministry with a 40-year hiatus, 40 days for Jesus. And then, you know, their birth, look at their birth. One of them ends up in the Nile River in a basket, and the other ends up in a cow barn. You know, the similarities just go on and on. And you know, here Moses had a lot of people he was trying to lead. Well, Jesus was just trying to teach 12 people how to live the life that he had come to give everybody. But there were always those who doubted, those who betrayed him. Well, life is that way. And I'm hoping that and praying that when you think about God grooming Moses or Joshua for Moses' job, God is the last words he says to Joshua, be strong and courageous. And I think that being strong as a person, as a Christian, and being courageous enough to act it out in good faith and in love to others is what this lesson is all about. Thank you.